Welcome back, you beautiful bastards, to another episode. We have a fantastic guest this week. Jerry, what are we doing?
Well, let me tell you about a book. And give me a second. It's a long title here. It's called Mental Immunity: Infectious Ideas, Mind Parasites, and the Search for a Better Way to Think. And it's fantastic. I haven't read it yet, but I know the ideology, especially after we spoke to the author, PhD Andy Norman, an award-winning author, by the way. He's been on all kinds of podcasts, all kinds of media outlets, and he's done a lot of research on this topic of mental immunity. I know a lot of you probably haven't really heard the term before, but you're going to know it when you're done with this episode.
It's a great conversation.
He is a great guy, and I think that his idea and what this book is about is probably one of the most important things that you could read right now.
Oh, definitely. With the way the world's turning, this is something a lot of people should get into.
And it's actually a lot of what this show is about. So check it out.
What is happening, you beautiful bastards?
I got to imagine that confirmation bias is one of the hugest aspects of a mind parasite. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, Andy. How's it going?
It's going great. It's nice to be here. Thank you.
So Andy, we came across your book on the internet, and I haven't had a chance to read it. It looks like it's quite a bit to take in, but it's an interesting idea, and I think it's an idea that not a lot of people have heard of this, although maybe they've thought of something similar themselves, but I think it gives a lot of power to give a name to something.
Yeah.
And what we're talking about is mental immunity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a fantastic name, and knowing what the idea is, I kind of realized I had similar thoughts myself.
Yeah.
And I was just curious if you could break it down in a simple way for the listeners to understand really what mental immunity is.
Yeah. I mean, you're right that the book goes pretty deep into some philosophical questions, but the central idea is quite simple. So in the same way that our bodies have immune systems that protect us from infectious microbes, it turns out that although we have not historically talked this way, our minds have immune systems also, and they protect us from infectious ideas to one or another degree, right? I actually argue in the book that bad ideas of all kinds can actually be fruitfully thought of as mind parasites, as bundles of information that can basically infect minds, spread from mind to mind, and actually, in some cases, result in what scientists are now calling infodemics or cognitive contagion of one kind or another. So when we see crazy ideas spread around the world across the internet, to my way of thinking about it, that's a kind of cognitive contagion. And the best way to halt cognitive contagion, I think, is to build up our mind's immune systems so that we're less vulnerable to disinformation, propaganda, and other bad ideas.
The timing of your book is pretty perfect with the way the world's going nowadays.
Well, thanks. That's one way of looking at it. The other way is, why didn't I come out with this 20 years ago before this happened?
So have you actually been researching this particular topic for the duration of the last 20 years? Is this a long-going effort for you?
Yeah, so I'm a philosopher by training, and the particular specialty within philosophy is called epistemology, which is just a fancy word for thinking about thinking, and thinking about how we can think better. So philosophers for thousands of years have been trying to figure out how we can become wiser. And it turns out that if you master certain basic habits of mind, you can become a wiser version of yourself. And I argue that the underlying scientific mechanism for that is our mind's immune system, and that we can actually train our mind's immune systems to get better at spotting mind parasites and weeding them out.
How is it that you propose that we strengthen our mind's immune systems?
Well, first and foremost, by understanding how they work. So that the closest traditional concept to my concept of mental immunity is critical thinking. You guys have probably used that term on your show. My my understanding is that you have a mission on the show to, among other things, help people learn how to become better critical thinkers.
Yeah,
Always.
that's a big thing for us, and we're both parents, and I actually promote critical thinking heavily with my kids because I can see them, succumbing to a lot of really bad ideas just from exposure to
Yeah.
the internet, their friends, all kinds of crazy things they come home with, and I always have to tell them, let's think critically about this. Does that even make sense?
I love it. So I became a huge fan of critical thinking about 35 years ago and started studying how it works and actually taught it for a good part of the intervening years. What I ended up learning is that the concept of critical thinking is kind of vague. It's sort of a blunt instrument. So if you take a course in critical thinking at university, they'll usually tell you, okay, you need to be more skeptical. You need to be more critical. And so view everything with a more jaundiced eye kind of thing. The problem with that advice is that it's too indiscriminate. It turns out you can be too critical for your own good. And the important thing is to be critical to the right degree about the right things and not too critical about the wrong things.
But how is it one to decipher what is the right and the wrong things?
That's the big question, right? That's the $1 million question in some ways.
Because if you're heading down that path of what we believe is the wrong thing, to you, you're going to think it's all right. I mean, if you ask, you can go anywhere with this, and later I plan on picking on Jerry with this, but if you take right now a hardcore Trump supporter, they're going to believe everything they're thinking, or anti-vax, they're going to think everything they're thinking is right, and they believe that's the right path.
Right. And so it's certainly true that people have very, very different conceptions of which ideas are the good ones and which ideas are the bad ones. And then the question becomes, well, how do we know who's right and who's wrong? Or in other words, who's to say, as we often say, as some people put the question. The first thing to understand is that it's not all subjective. Some ideas really are true, other ideas really are false, and some ideas really do frustrate our own aspirations, and other ideas really do promote common well-being and common flourishing. So there are objective facts of the matter as to which ideas are serving us well and which ideas are not. They're not always easy. It's not always easy to tell, but that doesn't mean there aren't facts of the matter to be discovered through careful investigation. And if we commit to that process of carefully investigating which ideas are good and which ideas are bad, which ideas are true, which ideas are false, we can actually get much, much better at it. And you can't compare, compare somebody who's studied quantum physics for 30 years and offers a carefully reasoned academic paper peer-reviewed paper on the subject, and your average QAnon believer who just hears some rumor on the internet and starts spewing it online.
Yep.
There's no comparison, right?
Yeah.
So there are more and less responsible ways of conducting our cognitive affairs. And it's important that we all learn how to become more responsible thinkers so that we can be decent citizens in this new hyper-connected info economy that we've created.
That's a difficult thing to do in this day and age when people are having a hard time putting in the research they should put into almost everything.
Yeah. Well, and there's literally endlessly deep rabbit holes you can go down on any one point of a very complex hypothesis, right?
Absolutely.
And so nobody has infinite time to do research. And so invariably we end up trusting some sources and not trusting others. And the trick is to actually put your trust in objectively reliable sources and not put your trust in objectively unreliable sources. I see that way of talking about it is getting the wheels turning.
There's always, the wheels are always cranking. It's just whether or not it's going to come out right.
Okay.
Yeah, so this idea of kind of falling into this trap of listening to bad ideas, you're calling this mind parasite, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a fascinating topic. I'm not really sure exactly how to break that down for people, other than maybe giving some examples. But let's dive into that a little bit, because I'd like to know a lot more about the concept of a mind parasite.
Yeah. So in some ways, that's just kind of an exciting way to talk about bad ideas.
Mm.
So I'm giving us a new way of viewing something that for many, many centuries we've just referred to as bad ideas.
Okay.
So think about the qualities that a bad idea possesses. So think about an idea that harms the mind that hosts it. Okay, so first of all, this idea is hosted by the mind the same way that a parasite can be hosted by
your body.
by a body, right? It can actually, it's not wrong to say that it can infect minds. Some mind infections actually induce their hosts to spread the infection to other minds, the same way that, say, the flu can get you to sneeze it off into other bodies, right?
Mhm.
And of course, if you grant that certain ideas can harm the people who possess them, and just think about suicide bombers, for example, right? These ideas have self-destructive beliefs. These ideas are objectively harmful of the very people who carry them. And it just seems to me that if it has if it requires a host, if it can spread from one to another, if it can be talked about as an infection, and if it can harm that host, that kind of checks all the boxes for something that deserves to be called a parasite.
Yeah, it's a great analogy of how a bad idea would work.
Yeah, and as humans, we have fantastic ideas that tend to go really wrong. And what we've effectively done, from my point of view, is we've given these mind parasites a superhighway.
Yes.
Not just with the internet, but with social media, which is
Yes.
the perfect place for these bad ideas to grow and replicate.
That's right. And you ask any epidemiologist who studies, the spread of COVID, and they'll tell you when people come into close contact with one another, the risks of transmission go up. What the internet does is it connects all of our minds. It basically eliminates social distance between our minds and makes us collectively more susceptible to mind infections than maybe humanity has ever been.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I got to imagine that confirmation bias is one of the hugest aspects of a mind parasite.
Yeah, that's one of the most powerful cognitive biases that psychologists like to talk about. So all of us like to be right.
Yeah.
Nobody likes to be proven wrong. And so scientists have shown again and again that we look for evidence that confirms the things we believe, and we tend to dismiss or brush aside or diminish evidence that we might be wrong. Now, we don't always do this, but when it comes to cherished beliefs, we can become very, very good at it. And confirmation bias leads us to have too much confidence in the beliefs we have and too little openness to the possibility that we still have a lot to learn.
Yeah, we like to believe on this show anyways that with the younger generations, you're seeing less of that, but I don't know that there's actually anything proving us correct on that one.
I wouldn't be surprised if growing up in the internet age makes you more open-minded, maybe less prone to confirmation bias. That seems to me plausible, in part because I know that confirmation bias is almost endemic among the very old. Like older people are more prone to get, or older Americans are more prone to be swept up by the QAnon conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
Right.
And many of them grew up in a world where you could trust the information sources around you. So their default setting in their mind is trust. And when you trust the wrong people, they will take advantage of you and infect your minds with ideas that can essentially manipulate you. And that's what's happening.
Yeah, where maybe the younger generation isn't so likely to believe things because they've grown up with so much misinformation that they've constantly had to fact check.
I think that's an excellent hypothesis, and it's worth testing empirically.
Yeah, God knows if I'm right.
So let's pick on these QAnon people for a second here. Obviously, QAnon, we can call that a bad idea, the whole concept of it. But when you have this many people that are affected by, I'll just stick with mind parasite for ease of the conversation. How do you deprogram something like that on such a big scale? Is it too late for people like that?
Yeah, it can be very hard. So it's a lot easier to prevent a mind infection than to cure one. So
Weird.
well, right. So I like to say an ounce of mind inoculation is worth a pound of cult deprogramming. So it can take years to deprogram somebody from a cultish set of beliefs.
Mm.
But there have been stories in the news lately about people who basically fell down the QAnon rabbit hole in a matter of weeks, like went from being, perfectly ordinary and into somebody who's just kind of a raving conspiracy theorist in a matter of weeks or months.
That's crazy. I can't.
Right. So we're talking about a set of ideas that is enormously infectious. I'm reading a book right now about how the core tenets of QAnon have evolved over time. You can actually, just do internet searches that tell you how the QAnon. I mean, Q's been issuing these drops, these supposedly clandestine information drops every once in a while. But you look at the way in which Q does that. A lot of these drops make the people who believe them feel like they're in the know, like they know some deep, important secret, it gives them hope that the giant conspiracy that's oppressing them will be exposed and that they'll be liberated. So the ideas that Q is propagating kind of push all of the levers for people who feel desperate and in need of validation, who need to feel like they're in on something important, that need to feel like they matter, that need to feel hope.
Which is like cookie cutter for anything cult. Like if you look at any cults that started throughout the beginning of, just even America, everyone they bring in the beginning is someone they're looking for a purpose. They're looking for validation. It's happened so many times over, yet it's still happening.
Well, and I think it's worth acknowledging that we all need to feel like we matter, right? We all need to feel like we belong. These are very deep and very powerful human emotions. And when somebody comes along and says, hey, believe these things and you can become part of us and you'll be special and you'll make a big historical difference. You'll save our nation or you'll be whisked away to heaven or whatever it is. Those ideas can be enormously seductive, right? They appeal to real human needs that are not being met in other ways. So I think we need to, as easy as it is to disdain or laugh at people who believe outrageous things, I think we also need to be compassionate and sympathetic, because
absolutely,
a lot of times these beliefs are serving real emotional needs.
It's so easy to judge from the outside when you have the full picture. When you're on the inside and whatever has happened in someone's life to where they have those blinders on and that's all they can see, you can't judge them for that, because God knows what happened in there.
And I also think that we all have blind spots, right?
Oh, totally.
So I think I have a relatively complete picture of what's going on with the QAnon, enough anyway to know that it's hugely unlikely to be true, right? But there are other areas where I'm sure I'm just clueless.
Oh,
right.
And I think everyone is, but it seems like you're looking at the QAnon thing with almost like an observation or a research in mind. You know what I mean? You're looking at it from a different point of view than, oh my God, he's right. This is exactly what we need. That you're not going for that confirmation bias, at least not in that sense, where you're trying to look at it in almost like a research project.
Yeah, I don't have any particular axe to grind when it comes to QAnon. I mean, when I come to the question of, wow, are these claims about the Satan worshiping pedophiles ruling our nation really true? I don't have any deep emotional needs one way or the other. And in that sense, I think I can bring a certain level of fair-mindedness to the question. But well, perhaps I should back off of that a little bit. If it turned out that the world really was run by Satan worshiping pedophiles and I was all wrong about the real structure of our democratic republic, that would be hard to accept. So maybe I'm not as unbiased.
It'd be perfect for the book.
And I think the perfect thing to look at here and how we've evolved as a society. Let's go back to like 2005 to 2010 when social media was uh, kind of in its infancy.
Okay.
We, especially Grizz and I, who were younger back then, we've seen the evolution of this. And I went from enjoying the conspiracy theories because I thought they were amusing to watching people slowly drift to the side where that became reality for them. And
Hmm.
what I've noticed, you can't really just change their mind because, as you say, they were preying on a vulnerability that these people wanted to fill.
Mhm.
And I've spoken to many people and seen many people go down this path. And what I believe watching this happen is it's so hard to change their mind because they didn't get there through logic. They didn't use reason. So you can't reason a person out of a position that they didn't reason themselves into. And that's a tough situation to solve.
I think that's largely true. That there's more and more research coming out on this, and it indicates that it can be very hard to reach people like this and help them escape these ideas that really aren't serving even them very well. I mean, if you derive a short-term satisfaction from the idea that you're in on a big, that you can see through a conspiracy that nobody else does,
Mm-hmm.
that might make you feel good for a while, but you're probably going to start losing friends who think you're kooky, and it's not even in your own best interests, right? Um, Now, how do you help people like this? One thing we know now from the research is that going in and just trying to refute their position often fails, and
Yeah.
it can't even backfire. In fact, it can harm the relationships that you need to help people climb out of rabbit holes. So when people do climb out of rabbit holes successfully, it's because they have a relationship with somebody they trust and who's willing to hear them out, listen, and help them examine the ideas in a way that lets them make up their own mind. So if I've been sucked into a cult or a conspiracy theory and you want to help me, um, a good thing to do is just say, "Hey, Andy, tell me more.
Mm.
Um, tell me about these beliefs of yours and flesh them out for me so I really understand them. Help me understand." And a lot of times, if I'm busy explaining it, sometimes the defects and the inconsistencies in my view will start to become apparent even to me, because when I'm talking about it, I start to realize I don't understand it as well as I thought I did.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense.
Right. But if you're busy just trying to poke holes in it, I'm likely to dig my heels in and say, to heck with you. You've been brainwashed by the lamestream media or whatever.
Yeah. Well, we're humans. We're immediately going to go
Right,
on the defensive, and we don't want to lose an argument.
And one of the really interesting findings of this new science I'm trying to promote, called it's the science of mental immunity, is that when we're thinking in a defensive or when we feel threatened, it's hard to reason in a fair-minded way. So if your cherished beliefs get challenged by somebody, especially in an aggressive way, you're liable to treat the information they're bringing to your attention as a threat rather than as an opportunity to learn.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so part of the art of thinking well is creating conversation spaces where nobody feels threatened, where people can actually say, "Hey, you know what? Let's just examine that together. Let's reason together and find out, not reason in order to win, not reason to prove you wrong, just so we can find the truth together." So the attitude you need to bring to dialogue with a conspiracy theorist is, I call it the way of inquiry. Just bring the let's find out mentality rather than a I'm gonna beat you down with my reasons mentality. Treat reasons as guides to another person, as tools for guiding other people's attention to relevant considerations. Never treat reasons as weapons.
That makes a lot of sense. So if we look back through history on a macro and a micro scale, there are two main paths that you can go down to enact change. One is revolution, the other is evolution.
Mhm.
Evolution, well, I'll get into that in a second, but the issue you run into with revolution, which is the confrontation path, every revolution starts a counter-revolution. So if you just completely confront someone's ideology without understanding it or putting them in a comfortable place, That's where you get this backfire we're talking about. You see it with countries,
That's right.
you see it with individual people. Pretty much every demographic you come across where ideologies are opposed,
Yeah.
if you confront it head on, they're going to confront it back. So you go to evolution, where you slowly, essentially work your way in. You understand their problems, build that relationship.
Hmm.
Then you're going to have a much easier time convincing them, in the case of mind parasites or bad ideas, that the idea is bad, and they're going to know why.
That's right. Yeah, everybody wants to feel as in control of their own mind, right? So if I come along and just say, I'm gonna set you straight, all of a sudden I start feeling pushed,
Mm-hmm.
right? And nobody likes to kind of be pushed around physically or mentally, right? So the right attitude to bring towards conversation and reasoning generally is, let me share with you things that I think make sense, and you can make up your own mind about them.
Mm-hmm.
And I respect your ability to make up your own mind. When you repeat to somebody, and as a teacher, you have to teach a teacher of philosophy in particular, you basically have to tell your students all the time, I'm not grading you based on whether you agree with me. I'm grading your work and based on whether you're showing me signs that you can think for yourself, right? And honestly, I'm going to put these ideas out there, and I want to know what you think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because you want to see what channels they're taking.
Yeah. Well, together we'll bring relevant considerations to light, and then everybody make up their own minds so that we all feel as though we're our own person and in charge of our own destiny. That's the attitude that lets people learn. I'm sorry.
No worries. Even in that sense, though, and with critical thinking and a questioning attitude, I still find it that with all of our biases, because we all have them in one shape or form, it would be very easy to go down a wrong path. You know what I mean? Because you can be questioning things all you want, but you can all of a sudden find, as we all have in certain ways, that we've gone down this rabbit hole, and next thing you know, you're in too deep.
Yeah, and one antidote to that, I think. So you guys have heard of this guy named Socrates, a Greek philosopher from
Yeah, it sounds familiar.
2,400 years ago, right? The guy loved to walk around the streets of Athens, Greece, and basically ask questions about people's core convictions. And he won some enemies because some sort of dogmatic people got their noses out of joint about this, and they made him drink hemlock, which is a poison, and that brought Socrates' life to an end. But what Socrates was really, really good at is basically using questions to clarify what exactly a person is saying, and then testing that idea to see whether it really makes sense. It's a very basic process, and it's one of the most powerful mind inoculants ever invented. I argue that Socrates basically prototyped a wonderful mind vaccine 2,400 years ago, but that we can take that mind inoculant and refine it into something even more powerful. And that's what I do in the final chapters of my book. To connect this with what you were saying, Andy, a lot of us walk around with this idea that if I can find good reasons for a belief, then it's reasonable.
Right.
That the true test of whether a belief is responsible and smart and true or whatever, are there good reasons for it? Turns out that idea is dead wrong, because you can find good reasons for anything. The real test is whether a belief can withstand questioning, or whether a claim can withstand questioning, and the tough questions that even a detractor might raise. Mm-hmm. So you have to be open to those questions if you want to test ideas properly. And you have to train your mind to not react defensively when people are helping you test ideas.
Actually, Grizz and I had a conversation earlier today. This is the perfect time to mention this, Grizz, because what I brought up was the perfect allegory for mental immunity, basically the best depiction of why this is important to ever grace the earth.
Share. I'm all ears.
So I'm sure you're familiar with the Matrix.
Sure.
it has really a lot of commonalities with 1984, the book, which Grizz still has not read,
No, I do need to read it.
especially nowadays. So, in the Matrix, you have Neo, who is living in what is effectively a completely contaminated parasitic world, mentally speaking. Everybody has fallen prey to this virtual world that is false information given to them. He has to find his way out, and that's on a personal level and on the grand scale in this movie, a perfect representation of the path that we, even though this was a cautionary tale, we've headed in that direction anyway, going closer to VR and false information. Now, Grizz telling me earlier today how dead wrong I was. Of course, it was confrontational, and I did have good, solid answers to all of his questions.
Yeah, I don't know about that part, but it was a good conversation.
You guys, I can see you guys bring the right spirit to these conversations, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, you're busy testing each other's ideas without, while maintaining a underlying sense of trust and cooperation, and that's the right way to test ideas. And maybe the question of whether Jerry's core ideas about the Matrix are really right or not, maybe the verdict's still out on that. But you've started the conversation, and it might take a while to play out.
See, this is where I believe Jerry has a mind parasite, because he has a belief that the simulation theory is real.
I didn't say real, I said plausible. I haven't seen evidence for or against it.
But
if you
that's
break down the
heading down that
information,
path.
if you break down the information, I can't say it's not true.
So
But I'm not going to say it is true.
So can I weigh in on this? This is a fun.
Absolutely, I'm ready for it.
This is a fun one. Yeah. Number one is it's generally not good practice to run around accusing people of harboring mind parasites. That's usually a way to lose friends.
No one said I was doing anything good here.
But I think, especially when it comes to your own ideas, entertain the possibility that some of your own beliefs might actually be mind parasites that need to be shown the door, that need to be ushered out. That it introduces a little humility, I think, and that humility can be a good thing. But back to the Matrix. So it's in principle possible that everything we experience is generated by a giant simulator. And the original version of this thought experiment, of this question, was raised by René Descartes, the French philosopher back in the 17th century. He basically said, what if there's an all-powerful demon that's basically just fooling you about everything?
Right.
So that was his version of the Matrix. And when Descartes published his Meditations on First Philosophy, philosophers read it and went, oh man, whoa. Just the same way, young people went, whoa, when they watched The Matrix. It was the Matrix of the 17th century.
Yeah, that actually, I would argue that maybe when I watched The Matrix, because I think I was only 11 when that came out, because I was 99, right?
Yeah.
And it kind of awakened this skeptical side of my mind where I saw this movie, and just like you say, my mind exploded. I saw everything that happened in this movie. I said, well, what if there's a lot of stuff that's really not real? And that has kind of taken me down a path where, like, I'll read a lot about the QAnon ideas and then the opposition to that, which would be the very farthest end of the spectrum on the liberal side. And I'll read both of them. And I actually get a lot of pushback from people when I tell them I get my news sources from both of the bad sources. Because their first question is, well, how do you know which one's right? And how do you know what part of each of those are right? The issue is you have to understand both sides to understand what's wrong with them.
Nice. I think that's a wonderful rule of thumb. I think it's worth thinking about this. Here's a possibility that you may not have made the effort to rule out. It's possible that you're a hallucinating aardvark on Mars, and that everything you think is real about your life on Earth is really just an aardvark hallucination.
You could just be a figment of my imagination.
So here's the question, right? Have you done due diligence to rule out that possibility? No, because this is the first time you heard of that possibility. Now, I can keep throwing out possibilities like that faster than you can rule them out.
Oh yeah.
In other words, if I want to basically try to undermine your confidence in everything you believe, it's just trivially easy to throw out objections that feel deep and powerful and like, whoa, man, if this is right, then everything has to change, right? But once you understand that that's kind of a trick, then you're less likely to be sucked in by this idea that Satan worshiping pedophiles run the nation, and a giant conspiracy of the lamestream media is why you're in the dark. Right? It's really easy to generate possibilities like that are very difficult to rule out in a rigorous way.
I was going to ask how he would rule out that he's not an aardvark, but
I'll defer to you guys on that.
We're screwed.
Yeah, and that actually, so that this brings to mind Pizzagate. So Grizz and I don't know if skeptical is the right term. I would say our mental immunity is very good. So, when we hear a story like that, we think it's kind of crazy. It's pretty unlikely. So, let's move on from that. We can't specifically do research on that topic, but there's also no evidence for it. And then when the people who believe in that give you the evidence, it's really just a lot of stuff that you got from Reddit. So it's a good, I think it's a good example, especially in real time, not necessarily going back to The Matrix in 1999, of the outcome when people just pour their mind into an idea like that. It's scary. It really is.
And let me confess something. So I think the Pizzagate idea is silly.
Right.
But I have not done any diligent research on whether or not it is true or false. But here's how I arrived at the conclusion that it's silly. It is vanishingly unlikely that Hillary Clinton would run a pedophile ring out of the basement of a pizza shop. I mean, it's just, it makes no sense that she would have those motivations. It makes no sense that would be how she does it. The odds are infinitesimally long.
There are many better ways to run a ring like that.
That's one way to put it.
On her own island.
So when I pay attention to what happens in your own mind when somebody suggests something like that there's a pedophilia ring running out of the basement of a pizza shop, it sounds like your mental immune system and my mental immune system generate all of these doubts.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And doubts are the antibodies of the mind. And I would argue that our doubts about this particular possibility are serving us well in this case. They do a quick check of the odds of that hypothesis being true. They say, that's nuts, and they throw it out.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That's a mental immune system functioning properly.
But there are some people out there who never question things like that. And it's not even that they want to confirm that. They don't doubt it. I don't know what that is.
Well, and there was the guy who showed up with a gun and actually shot off a couple of rounds in the pizza shop because he said later that he was new to the internet. He read about this and wanted to go rescue the children.
And that's a fair response if it was true. However, I guess this jury's still out. It hasn't been disproven per se, but I can tell you they didn't have a basement, so nothing was going on down there.
No basement at all. Look, I think we can honor the guy's motives, right? He wanted to save children. That's an admirable thing. But we can also, I think, express astonishment and dismay at the level of gullibility that he brought.
But that's happening way too often nowadays.
Well, I wouldn't say nowadays, Grizz, because let's take a look through history yet again. One of my favorite things. We're going to go back in time here. This same principle has caused the bulk, historically, of a lot of humanity's problems.
Mm-hmm.
Blind faith has caused things like the Crusades, which was a major issue. So how do you combat something where it's entirely faith-based? You can't reason your way into or out of that.
No. But one could argue that religions in general, and I'm going to alienate a whole lot of listeners, are cultish.
Yes.
I think Jerry's right that mental immune disorders or mind infections go back thousands of years, and entire civilizations have been torn apart by divisive ideologies. I mean, study the way the Roman Empire fell, and you realize that divisive ideologies overtook many of the citizens of the Roman Empire and helped to tear it apart. Think about the Dark Ages, right? A stultifying orthodoxy prevented inquiry in science for over 1,000 years. Disease was rampant. Those are bad ideas that lodged themselves very deep in people's minds and prevented Europe from evolving. So the problem I'm trying to illuminate with this talk of mental immunity and mind parasites, it goes back a long, long time, probably as long as human beings have been around. But I think that this new way of looking at it gives us powerful new tools for addressing the problem. Think about this, right? Before the germ theory of disease, human beings suffered enormously at the hands of smallpox and diphtheria and polio and malaria, many diseases. And then we began to understand how the body's immune system works, and we learned how to enhance it with vaccines and inoculants. I think we can do the exact same thing for our highly susceptible minds. We can learn how our mind's immune systems work. We can figure out why they fail. We can figure out how to make them work better and raise every kid in this world in a way that strengthens their mind's immune system against crazy conspiracy thinking and other maladaptive ideas.
I love the idea of it, but it kind of brings me into the whole, we were talking about this the other day. Lately in the news, you see that they've changed their rhetoric when it comes to vaccines versus being like, hey, you need to go get vaccinated. Now it's changed to the regretful, I didn't get vaccinated. People on their deathbed saying that, oh, I wish I got the vaccine. They're changing the way they're attacking it. But the problem is the people who need to hear that aren't going to hear it. And so, you know what I mean? Like, you can come at it in a different way, but just like in your book, the people who need to hear what you're talking about aren't going to hear it because they don't want to hear it.
Right. Well, and I've just written an article about this. If you look at what happens in the mind of, I mean, if you actually talk to somebody who's a vaccine denier, right?
And I think we both have. So
yeah, we have.
It's a good way to talk about it. Yeah.
Well, you can see how they start to get defensive really fast when you start to say, hey, vaccines really work. You should get vaccinated. A lot of times they start to feel threatened by the points you're making, and they dig their heels in, right? That's actually an autoimmune disorder of the mind. So in the same way that the body's immune system can overreact to pollen and give you an allergy attack, your mind can overreact to information it sees as threatening and attack it.
Right.
And that's what's happening in the minds, I think, of vaccine deniers, is their minds are on high alert against information they view as threatening their identities, and they attack it before they really have a chance to learn from it.
But so
and I actually love that. Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I agree with what you're. I assume you were going to say you love that analogy.
I love that analogy, but specifically because I have a autoimmune disorder, and what's interesting about the autoimmune comparison is I could potentially get sick, and my body reacts very quickly, and it overreacts. So whatever I got sick with could be dead and gone, but the end result is the same amount of destruction. I'm not actually. I don't just kill it and get better. I kill it and then I continue to get worse until I get it back under control. And the same thing appears to be happening with the information people are taking in on the internet now.
In some cases, that information is killing them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I read a heart-wrenching story the other day about a person who basically put off getting the COVID vaccine, figuring that if they ever got sick, they could have it then. And this person was basically on their deathbed and said, I want the vaccine now. And the nurse said, I'm sorry, sir, but it's too late.
Yeah, it's too late.
Yeah, we read that same article. Yeah.
Yeah. But so that's my point in what they're, so we've taken it, we've changed our approach trying to get people vaccinated to where we're going with these regretful stories. But the people who are reading them probably vaccinated. I assume you're vaccinated.
Oh yeah.
So there you go. So the three of us are all vaccinated. Guess what? The three of us read it, but the people who aren't probably didn't read it.
We're preaching to the choir here.
Exactly.
Well, so it's very hard to get people who don't want to listen.
Yeah, well, yeah. I
Right.
equate it to smokers, right? If I tell a smoker you shouldn't smoke, it's bad for you. I'm, if anything, just reaffirming themselves, and they're going to keep smoking. They need to realize it on their own.
Right. And there was a really interesting focus group run by a Republican pollster. He gathered together like 24 vaccine deniers, and he basically said, he said, just tell me why you guys are reluctant to get the vaccine. And he just let them talk for like an hour. Mm-hmm. And then he said, well, I happen to bring with me a former, an epidemiologist who actually understands how your body works. And he's here to answer your questions. And this guy who was an expert basically just sat there and answered people's questions one after the other. And at the end of the focus group, this pollster asked people, are you more likely now to get the vaccine than you were? And they all said yes. And I think what was exciting about that is that he took a listen first approach. Mm-hmm. He let people articulate their fears and their reservations, their qualms about getting vaccines. And once you've had a chance to be heard about that, there's a little space opens up for you to hear what somebody else has to say. If you listen first, people will sometimes learn from you. If you try to get somebody to learn before listening to them, it almost never works.
So I hope it works.
I think that the best way to solve issues like this is to understand, where it comes from, especially in the human mind. How do you get to a point like that? But I believe you have, I guess maybe it's a theory or some studies you've done on the evolution of how we came to think this way. Mm-hmm. Can you touch a little bit on that?
Yeah, so I've done some research on how human beings developed the capacity to reason.
Okay.
So we seem to be we are real outliers in the animal kingdom in terms of our tendency to generate noises that change other creatures' minds. So we run around spouting reasons all the time, earnestly trying to change each other's minds. And no other animal on Earth does this to the same degree that we know. And I argue in some research I did that was in some ways humanity's superpower. So biologists call human beings ultra social in the sense that we collaborate on a large scale in ways that almost nothing aside from like the social insects, ants and bees do. And what allows us to do this is the fact that we can sort of sync up our minds around the same goals and then work together. And the way we sync up our minds, I argue, is to use reasons to kind of gently nudge each other's worldviews into alignment with one another. Because when we see eye to eye, when we view our common problems in the same way, we can do great things together. But when the tribe starts to develop different views of the world and different views of how to solve the problems that world presents, they lose the ability to
they turn
collaborate, to sync up their behaviors in the right way. So I argue that Homo sapiens actually probably defeated all of all of our primate cousins and made many of them go extinct because we were far better at syncing up our mental states with reasons and thereby collaborating to good effect.
And that actually, that brings up another interesting point here, which I think maybe this evolution is where the idea of morality came from. Because if you look at the rest of the animal kingdom, generally speaking, there's a lot of intelligence. There's not a lot of what we consider morality. There is no, generally speaking, animals don't think it's bad to kill. It's just things get killed and they move on. But humans, we dwell on that for years. And that's a very unique human experience that it's got to come from that sort of evolution that the other animals in the kingdom didn't get.
I'm gonna gently push back on that one, Jerry.
Okay.
I do think there's a wonderful book called The Moral Animal about how humanity evolved, how our minds evolved. And it does argue that we are very much outliers in the animal kingdom. But the core elements of morality can be seen in many creatures. So when a chimpanzee will watch another chimpanzee get hurt in a battle and go over and put its arm around them and comfort them. So
Really?
sympathy and compassion. So one of the core elements of our concept of morality is the idea of fairness.
Right.
Have you ever seen the famous video of the capuchin monkeys?
I don't think so. I haven't.
So
What
check
were they
this.
doing in the video?
This is okay. This is amazing. So you take two, I think it's capuchin monkeys, and you put them in, and they're in adjoining cages, and you teach each of them to kind of hand you a pebble, and if they hand you a pebble, they get a reward.
Okay.
So you do this for a while until both monkeys get it, and then you get one monkey number one gives you a pebble, and you give him a cucumber. And cucumbers are pretty good, but grapes are way better. And so you get a pebble from the monkey number two, and he gets a grape. The first monkey throws a fit because it's not fair. He throws the cucumber at the experimenter, saying,
Of course.
I'm not going to cooperate with your damn game if you're not going to give me grapes.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, I guess you can kind of see that even in like baby humans. I have 2 kids, and I like to remind them all the time life is not fair. And my personal opinion is no matter how smart your kid is, they're not that many steps above a monkey because they're doing a lot of developing.
Most
And
adults too.
even at a very young age, I see the same thing. And I never really considered maybe that animals are going through the same thing to a certain extent.
Social mammals in particular.
So yeah, social mammals. So that's got me curious. Do we know really how far-reaching that is in the animal kingdom, or is that not really empirically studied?
So the study of animal behavior is called ethology, and
Okay.
ethologists have really been looking at how social animals cooperate. And it turns out that social sympathies, compassion, empathy, trust, gratitude, these are the emotions that induce us to be cooperative.
Right.
And we're witnessing behavior in wolves, in primates, in dolphins, in whales, and lots of certainly larger brained mammals that to all appearances show deep compassion and caring and concern for one another.
And all of those have that like pack or pod mentality though. I mean, if you take something that's just a lone wolf in the sense, they're not going to have that same mentality.
That's probably true, but it's interesting that wolves are in fact a pack species for the most part. Lone wolves are rare.
Lone wolf, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and actually, Grizz, that's a good point. And as an avid people watcher, I would argue, based on what I've seen, that humans are also pack animals for the most part.
Oh, we are. We're tribal.
Yeah.
Absolutely, 100%.
Deeply. By the way, Jerry, you mentioned kids show signs of moral sensibilities young, and you've seen it in your own kids.
Right.
There's some wonderful demonstrations of this on video. You can find these on YouTube. So a little kid, like 18 months old, is sitting on his mom's lap in a studio, just in a lab room, right? And the experimenter walks in and he starts pinning up laundry on a clothesline, and he drops one of the clothes pins, and he pretends like he can't reach it. He goes, oh, I can't reach the clothespin. And this kid, 18 months old, can't even really speak. It's a toddler. Will jump out of its mom's lap, walk over, pick up the clothespin, and hand it to the experimenter because he can see that the experimenter is distressed and wants to help.
Just like a monkey.
Just like a monkey.
Yeah, I actually have a lot of since we're on the topic of kids, I have a lot of conversations with my son in particular. He's going into 6th grade, so I think he's running into a lot of these traps, these mental traps and moral quandaries a lot more than my daughter, who's going into 1st grade. And he is now reaching an age where his friends are sharing things from social media, and he's seeing a lot of things. If he sees TikTok or YouTube, he'll come and tell me about what amounts to a really wacky theory. or a conspiracy. I can't remember off the top of my head one of the ones that he's done because there's so many now. But my first question is, that sounds crazy. Do you think it really happened? And then I can see the cogs start to move in his brain. He's like, well, yeah, sure, why not? So I was like, oh, well, what do you think happened to them? And then we just go through, like you've said, I go through a lot of these questions.
Love it.
And then I point out, sounds crazy, right? He's like, yeah, I guess you're right. And then he goes off and finds a new theory. And it's almost every day now. It's a fun experience, but it's the only thing I can do, really.
You're doing the right thing, I think. Encouraging kids to test their own ideas with questions. And so here's my favorite story. My son, we took him to a holiday party, and there was a guy in a Santa suit there. And this kid comes over, and my son Kai comes over, and he tugs at my shirt, and he says, "Hey, Dad, that's not the real Santa." And I was like, "Really? How do you know?" He said, "I looked out the window. There's no sleigh outside." I'm like, "Attaboy."
Yeah, we've actually gone through almost the exact same thing. My son has been questioning holidays and holiday mascots since he was probably, I say 4 years old was the first time he really started to seem like he thought it was suspicious. And my daughter, for whatever reason, my wife still had a couple of teeth left over from the tooth fairy. And my daughter found them. And she came to me and said, "Look what I found. I knew it. And she showed me her teeth, and she was like, "You guys are the tooth fairy." And then my son was like, my son said, "I knew it. Who else are you? What else do you guys do?"
I love it.
I have a lot of faith in their ability to maintain mental immunity because they've been suspicious of my lies since as soon as they could reason.
Well, and they haven't given up entirely on you as a reliable source, I guess, because of these lies.
No, not yet.
Not yet. Hey, did I tell you about the Truth Fairy?
No.
I was on the Joe Rogan podcast, and I meant to talk about the Tooth Fairy as an example of gullibility in young kids.
Right.
And I misspoke. I said the Truth Fairy, and like Joe Rogan, totally cracks up and says, "You ought to write a kid's book about that." And so I'm actually doing that right now.
I'll definitely be getting that for my kids.
My son, for the longest time, has questioned the whole Santa Claus thing, and I come back at him with, "Why am I going to do all this work for someone else to get all the credit?" And he's like, "Oh, yeah, I guess so," and then never questions it again. Someday that'll bite me in the ass.
Yes, when you've realized that you've totally destroyed his critical thinking skills.
Yeah, exactly.
You've compromised his mental immune system.
Absolutely. I was trying to think. There was this experiment they did. I want to say it was California because everything crazy happens over there. But where they took a bunch of people and they basically told them that they needed to electrically shock people. They couldn't see the people, but they had to electrically shock them on the other side. I know what you're talking about, yeah. And I'm trying to remember, Jerry, I don't know if you can look it up. I cannot remember the name of this.
I do. I think I know the one you're talking about. This is the Stanley Milgram experiments.
Yes.
I think it was at Stanford, maybe.
And it was, and people, it got to the point where they weren't really shocking anyone. It was just actors on the other side acting it out. But to the point where they thought they were going to kill people. And they would still go through with it. And what they were trying to prove was the whole thing of Germans during World War II in Nazi Germany and why they would buy into, the Nazis and why they would do the things they would do, even though they might not believe it in themselves.
Right.
And I mean, that's a perfect example with what you're talking about. And that was a matter of hours.
Yeah. The Nazi campaign was one of the worst assaults on mental immunity in history.
I think that's right. And hey, I spot another mind parasite here. Jerry, I went after one of your mind parasites before. Now I got to go after one of Andy's.
Oh, I got plenty.
So this Stanley Milgram did this shock experiments, right, where he got test subjects to administer what they thought were almost lethal shocks.
Yeah, it was increasingly in dosage or
right.
Not in voltage.
And this study was created a sensation. And because it came in the aftermath of World War II, a lot of people were struggling for an explanation of why Nazi prison guards would obey orders, right, and do the kind of things they did to concentration camp people in concentration camps. So it turns out, though, that a lot of his data was fudged.
Mhm.
And it was, and Milgram's experiments were actually really sloppily done. And there's a wonderful book out called Humankind, A Hopeful History, that argues that Milgram's experiments was one of several that helped to paint a really dark picture of human nature in the wake of World War II, and that got a ton of play just because they fed a human need to make sense of the Holocaust, but that actually they distort human nature, that it's actually, that human beings are actually much more resistant to harming and causing distress than those experiments make it look.
Yeah, well, that kind of goes in line with what I've always thought, where you hear all this rhetoric through media, but if you actually go with your day-to-day life, how many people do you come across that are this angry or this emotional or always battering the stuff? One of my biggest ideas was I was a car mechanic for many years.
Mm.
And I worked with an older gentleman who had a thing against homosexuals. And he listened to all the stations that you would think he listened to. And he had one day where he was going nuts. Now, my mother-in-law is a lesbian. And I didn't take offense to it too much, but I questioned it. And I was like, he always said, they're always up in your face. They're always saying all this stuff. And I said, how many gays have you actually had up in your face? How many have always been doing all this stuff? And he kind of does this back and forth. And I was like, no, how many? And he said, well, none. I said, exactly. Stop listening to the media. If you look around the world around you, you're not going to find that anything is actually showing you that this is true, but you keep wanting to buy into it. So therefore it's true to you. Well, and in the end, he finally listened to me, but
that's a neat story, and in part because it's an example of somebody who sort of bought into a kind of fear mongering, right? That there are people out there who have made a very lucrative career for themselves by convincing you that the gays are trying to destroy the institution of marriage, Democrats are trying to spend all your taxes, and it's the death panels are going to consign grandma to death, right? I mean,
Yeah.
The kind of fear mongering, it's very easy to spread disinformation through fear mongering.
Oh yeah,
by spreading fear, and fear is a very powerful emotion. You can hijack somebody's mind by convincing them that they're endangered when they're really not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's again, that's preying on that vulnerability. It's one of the greatest human weaknesses.
And we talked about really that the other day, Jerry.
Yeah, it's how these crazy ideologies spread, and that's the biggest issue I see now is these heavily competing ideologies, especially on the political stage, right?
Yes.
And they're so far apart and so combative that I don't see a clear path to them coming into the middle, because I have friends on both sides of the spectrum, and I can talk to them and they assume I'm on their side because I'm not on the other side. Right. But the best way that I can describe it is I'm a logical voter. I can't really justifiably put myself on either side of that line, especially with the political ideologies that are now popular.
Mm-hmm. And I like the way you describe that. Rather than identify as a Republican or a Democrat, there's an alternative, which is just identify as somebody who does the right thing or does the reasonable or the logical thing. And then, of course, you're free to approach any given partisan issue with an open mind and not feel threatened if people raise valid points on one side or the other. So one of the way out of this kind of culture war that we've created is to teach people that it's a bad idea to identify with a political ideology. You do that and your mind starts to close.
Yeah.
But that makes you almost think that it's almost solely just by giving it a name. Just the fact that we've put it out there and, hey, there's this group and this group. Now, granted, we know there's much more than that, but by having two, you have to pick a side.
Yeah.
Inherently, it's doomed.
It is, I think, but it's also very seductive, right? Everybody has to answer the question, who am I?
Right.
And and it's nice to have a one-word answer to that. I'm a Christian. I'm a Muslim. I'm a Republican. I'm a Democrat. But labels don't really capture who you are.
Not at all.
And it, it, actually, a good alternative to thinking of yourself using any of those descriptors is I'm a advocate of honest inquiry.
Mm.
I have to start using that, Grizz.
Well, the problem is my brain already went to, we need to work on that. Like, we need to make it better. Yeah, we're screwed.
Now, when it comes to these the two sides, a lot of people want to pick a side because they, especially now, they view
We're tribal.
the other side as, we're tribal. But what I have found, and I'm still trying to work on how to convince people that some of their ideas are bad and they shouldn't be 100% on one side or the other, is if I tell them, if I'm talking to a Democrat and they think I'm agreeing with them and they realize that some of my ideas could be Republican, they say, "Oh, you're a Republican." And I tell them, "Well, no, I'm not. I'm kind of in between. I'm not a libertarian, but I'm like in between because I think both sides are wrong, but both sides have a lot of good points." Then, of course, I get the eye roll. "Oh, you're one of those. Oh, both sides are the problem." When at the end of the day, it's true. So I struggle with trying to convince people to see logic when that's their view of the world.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a related danger, which logicians call false equivalence.
Right.
So an attractive way out of, so culture wars and disagreement and confrontation make a lot of people uncomfortable, me included, right? And so if Republicans and Democrats are busy pointing fingers at each other, a very popular way to deal with that is just say to pox on both their houses. They're all equally corrupt. Just I'm just going to check out and not be political at all. The problem with that is that Democrats and Republicans may each have their issues and their blind spots, but they're not all equally bad on every issue. And simply checking out and giving up the game is a responsibility avoidance approach. Far better to say, I'm a person who cares about the truth. I'm a person who cares about justice. I'm a person who cares about logic, and then do the work of figuring out who's right where.
Yeah, I think that's what the basic assumption is when I come up with that point. Because I'm not saying to these people, there's no point in being in either camp because they're both completely wrong. I'll point out something like what Republicans call entitlement programs, right? So we can talk about something like universal basic income, which a lot of Democrats will push for. They advocate for that. And sure, it's a good idea and might even end up a requirement as things get more automated. But then I take what they view as the Republican stance, which is, well, how will you pay for that? It's a good idea,
question, right?
But the other half of that idea is the source.
Yep.
And I'm still struggling with people assuming that I'm in that camp of everybody's wrong, so let's just go home. And that's one of those things that I'm trying to figure it out.
I mean, the real path to wisdom on, say, on the issue of universal basic income is to let the progressives make their points, and you look at them one after the other, and you try to appreciate where they're making valid points. And then you listen to the conservatives and hear them out, and where they call our attention to valid considerations, you acknowledge those also. And it's a both and, right?
Yeah.
People on both sides of an issue can each have be focusing on a valid aspect of a very complex situation. And the path to wisdom recognizes the truth on both sides.
Yeah. Yeah, you remember when this country used to do that? That was long before I was born.
I'm old enough to remember.
Yeah, it is concerning to me looking to the future in that regard, because I have a lot of concern for what my kids are going to have to live with.
Yeah.
I don't see it getting better right now. I just see it getting a lot worse, a lot more divided.
Well, it's got to get worse before it gets better.
I suppose.
I agree, but let me mention that I think that my book contains the answer to this, that
Okay.
if we can actually develop the science of mental immunity and then develop and use the findings to develop our immunity to bad ideas, we can learn to dialogue together in a fruitful way. I don't know if that it's the linchpin or the hinge point for turning our culture war around, but I think it could play a big role in that regard. And in the same way that immunology transformed the human condition, I think cognitive immunology, the science of mental immunity, could totally transform our culture on this key dimension.
Right. So that's kind of how we would bring these two ideologies together in maybe more of a more unified theory for the country.
Yeah. So what if we sat down, what if we set aside our political differences and just said, hey, let's actually figure out how to dialogue together properly.
Mm.
Let's figure out how to reason together in a fruitful way, and then let the chips fall where they may. Then you read my book and you say, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. It makes sense to reason like that together. Now let's try it. And then you sit down over the tough issues like immigration or universal basic income. And then you have those conversations. And they're not easy. They're not going to spit out simple answers in a complex world. But having those dialogues is the way to bring minds together.
And what does that dialogue improvement look like for you? How do we get from where we are now to the point where we can do that?
I think part of it's practice.
Yeah.
So in the book, I mean, my research specialty is how dialogue works and what kind of norms make for a fruitful dialogue and what norms lead to dialogue that goes nowhere, or conversations that go nowhere. So that's the thing I've been passionate about for a really long time. And I argue that if we all just take a little bit of time to understand how to dialogue together in a fruitful way, our thinking starts to improve. And our ability to think together in ways that actually reconcile us and create a meeting of the minds, that starts to improve. But you can't just kind of waltz in from a lifetime of being a culture warrior and suddenly become mentally immune to bad ideas. You got some work to do, right? You need to practice this art by sitting down with people who disagree with you and listening.
It's definitely something we need a lot more of these days.
Now, that's got me kind of curious because it's, we've mentioned social media earlier, and we actually talk about it a lot on this show. Grizz and I, neither of us have social media for the most part. I mean, we have it for the show, and I think Grizz has a Facebook, but he doesn't use it per se. He's
Just
not
for
on
the
it.
show.
Yeah. So now I'm curious, do you happen to have a social media, and how do you view it if you do?
Yeah, I'm kind of a inept and half-hearted social media user.
Yeah,
I,
that's us too.
I mean, I spend a little time on Facebook trying to connect with friends, but I've also created a Facebook account for this journey I'm on where I'm trying to promote this book and the ideas in it.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the core ideas, you can find them on the Andy Norman author page on Facebook. I break it down into bite-sized chunks and share links to articles about these things, some of the background research. It's kind of a fun way to get the feel for the book and might, who knows, might even convince you that it's worth a read.
Yeah, it's a little bit ironic, right, that one of the biggest culprits of the issues we have are one of our biggest tools to fix it right now. Is that I don't think we have a lot of other options, right?
Yeah, I've got a real love-hate thing going with social media right now. It's not bringing
Us
out the
too.
best in us, I think.
No, not at all.
But if those of us who mean well and who want to promote the common good just cede social media to the different disinformation peddlers and the demagogues, that's not going to work out terribly well. We have to get in there and do battle with not do battle with. Gently confront the bad ideas.
That's a good point. So let's say you could do something major yourself about this. What would be the single greatest thing that you could implement if you had that power to really help us get where we need to be?
I
Maybe
think,
it's not even a single thing.
yeah. Well, so in the book, I end up arguing for a dozen things you can do to strengthen your mind's immune system. And I'll just mention one or two. But one of them is to learn to listen to your doubts. and listen to the doubts that other people express, because those are the antibodies of the mind, and they're usually trying to call your attention to genuine defects in an idea. There's a little voice in the back of your head. When you encounter a bad idea, a lot of times there's a little voice in the back of your head that says, something's not quite right here. Learn to listen to that voice and learn to focus in on it until you can hear what it's saying and put its qualms, put its reservations in words. Learn to articulate in the form of a question the reservations that your doubts are trying to surface. Make them explicit, and do it not just about ideas that you disagree with. Learn to listen to the doubts this voice has even about your favorite ideas, and your thinking will start to get sharper and wiser.
Heavy thoughts for the listeners, and I think fantastic advice.
Well, thanks. I think we all need to treat the doubts and questions of others as learning opportunities rather than threats too.
I like that one.
If we can do that, we can transform this minefield of a culture war that our nation has become back into a place of common purpose and mutual affirmation. And we really need to get busy on that.
I think that is the perfect sentiment to end this on. So before we go our separate ways, Andy, can you tell everybody where they can get your book, what the title is, and where they can find out more information about you and this, I think, society-changing idea?
Thank you very much, Jerry. Yeah, here, I'll show it on the screen too. The book's called Mental Immunity, with the perhaps provocative subtitle, Infectious Ideas, Mind Parasites, and the Search for a Better Way to Think. It's available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookshop.com, pretty much wherever books are sold. You can certainly walk into a mom and pop bookstore too and ask for it, and they'll probably find it for you. Yeah, I hope you'll check it out. I think I poured a lot of energy and a big chunk of my life into understanding these things, and I'm excited to share it with the world. And join me, and together we'll bring about the cognitive immunology revolution.
Love it.
Well, thanks for being on the show. That's going to be my next read. So we really appreciate you being here.
My pleasure, guys. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right, listeners, and Andy, that was some serious shit. I don't think I need to tell you that's a lot to think about. What do you think?
Dude, I thought it was great. Again, that's a hard nut to crack, man, when people are going down that rabbit hole.
It's a complicated problem. And, as you heard from the conversation, there's no direct solution, no direct resolution to what's going on. It's communication, critical thinking.
Having those conversations.
Those things that have gotten weaker on a general population level.
I know, because I'm guilty of it at times. You're trying to prove people wrong. And realistically, maybe we just need to try to understand them.
And this is where the part comes in where you just open your mind to the idea of the Matrix, and we have a fruitful conversation about it.
Nope. See, Jerry, you're spreading your mind parasite, you motherfucker. All right? Stop it. Okay? You're infesting people.
Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the show anyway.